Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a Friday Reads. 3 books read. The Idiot by Elif Batuman, Perfidious Albion by Sam Byers, the non-fiction Jane Allison's Meander Spiral Explode. So I'm going to start with The Idiot, a 5-star read. As I explained in my How I Rate Books, one of those 5-star reads that isn't a mind-blowing, oh my god, you simply have to read this, but this is a really good, solid, enjoyable read. But there's a bit more to it than that. I appreciated certain things that she was doing in this book. So it's the story of an 18-year-old about American of Turkish origin who is about to start at Harvard. And there's one person she knows there, but basically it's about the sort of the randomness of connection, of relationship, of network. And the book starts with an explanation of this is the 1980s. This is the start of emails replacing letters. That's quite key, really. I'll come back to why that is. So she goes to Harvard, and it goes through sort of trying to sign up on courses, and some are available to her and some aren't, and it's all a bit sort of Kafkaesque bureaucracy. So even her sort of subject course choices are sort of random, and therefore the people she ends up befriending on those courses, because they've all been sort of thrown together, that is random. She has roommates, but she is not particularly close to them, so they could have been part of the random mix, but they're not. And she is a blank slate. She's a tabula rasa. And the book is written in that style, whereby there's very little sort of intention or purpose or premeditation on her part. Things just sort of happen to her and imprint on her, and her personality starts to form by these random events, by these relationships. And I think that's what makes the book really interesting. I don't believe an 18-year-old is a tabula rasa, but for the purposes of this conceit, I think it works really well, because it's not just the randomness of a sort of spatial randomness of who's in her proximity at any one time. It's also a randomness about language. She is one of the things she's supposed to be majoring in is linguistics, but she doesn't really get the chance to sign on to many of the courses. So there's a theory here called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is derided by Chomskyians, but it's something I believe there's something to it as well, which basically sort of says that different languages allow or facilitate different perceptions. That it's not a universal level of perception and understanding, because the language and the grammar that you happen to speak as your main language affects that. And the reason I believe in that is because there are certain tribes in sort of lesser developed parts of the world who have different colour spectrums to us. And the reason they have different colour spectrums to us is because they don't have the language of certain colours that we do. So, for example, they might have 2 colours blended into one and only have one word for it, whereas we would have 2. And there are certain colours that do not exist in certain tribes. So this is why I believe it very much does form part of how we think. So here's a little paragraph. In my heart, I knew that Whorf was right. I knew I thought differently in Turkish and in English, not because thought and language were the same, but because different languages forced you to think about different things. Turkish, for example, had a suffix, mish, that you put on verbs to report anything you didn't witness personally. You were always stating your degree of subjectivity. You were always thinking about it every time you opened your mouth. The suffix mish had no exact English equivalent. It could be translated as it seems, or I heard, or apparently. I associated it with Dilek, my cousin on my father's side, tiny, skinny, dark complexioned. Dilek, who was my age but so much smaller. You complained, miss, to your mother, Dilek would tell me in her quiet, precise voice. The dog scared miss you. You told miss your parents, and if Aunt Julia came to America, she could live in your garage. Now I find that really fascinating, because in a way it opens up to me sort of thinking about hyper-reality, and that is those things you think you thought yourself, but actually have penetrated your psyche through media, be it TV, film, radio, something you read in a newspaper, some speech, political, buzz phrase or whatever. We take it as our own, And I wonder in Turkey, with this concept of mish, whether they would be able to realise and appreciate that it's something that they heard on TV or whatever. But anyway, but this isn't the only aspect of how language sort of operates here. And it's, in a way, it's about how language isn't fit for purpose, because she, like several of the characters in here, are multilingual. And so it's not only but thinking and speaking different in different languages mean you're thinking differently, or trying to convey a different concept to a non-native speaker or whatever. But there's sort of some clever things like, so, you know, she gets a Spanish, is it Spanish? She gets a guidebook and comes sort of dictionary, and she sort of, you know, reads it as if she was reading a novel, because it trying to form a narrative out of the random sort of phrases in a tourist guidebook, you know, fractures meaning, it doesn't enhance meaning, it's unlikely to get you anywhere when you go to that country. So it's all the time sort of playing around with, we are unable to communicate with ourselves, with each other, we are unable to form genuine understanding relationship, which is at the heart of this book, because she has this relationship with a guy called Ivan who's on her Russian course. And it is really a love relationship, but neither of them are able to express it. And they first start communicating by email. They send these weird and wonderful emails to each other where they're not like anybody else, and the sort of the flights of language and the flights of fancy and the flights of their thinking, they connect, they definitely connect, and it's not normal sort of conversation. But when they meet in the flesh, they're sort of forced back on speaking conversationally, not these sort of creative sort of flights of fancy, and they're never really able to express what they actually feel. And this book, that love is never even admitted, let alone consummated. So it's a really interesting concept about how language sort of fails us and you know, flaws us. In Russian class, we had to retell the plot of Lermontov's The Fatalist. The big question was whether our fate was written in the sky. The story made no sense to me, and I didn't retell it well. I kept saying he threw himself onto the table instead of he threw the card onto the table. There was a one-syllable difference. I said it wrong 7 times. Irina kept correcting me. She mimed someone throwing herself on the table so I would see my mistake. I didn't hear the difference until the 8th time. So again, you know, not only do we have a sort of random spatial proximity, but it's almost like language is random, or like sort of DNA replication. One tiny mistake, one syllable in this case, and the whole meaning is sort of turned on its head. And you know, that permeates throughout the book. In a way, nothing happens, and yet lots of things happen, because there's lots of incidents that she sort of finds herself observing at the centre of, you know. So the book is about her first year at Harvard, and then in the summer holidays, she sort of finds herself sort of signing up to go and teach English as a second language in deepest rural Hungary. And she's sort of passed around from family to family to family, because they've each got different needs of why they need English or what they need English for. She's very passive, you know, as I say, a tabula rasa, things are stamped on her, things are imprinted on her, and through that she develops her own character. I just thought this had a lot of really interesting ideas. It doesn't have much of a drive or a through line or a pace to it, but if you accept that, I think there was a lot to be got out of this book. So 5 stars. And on to Perfidious Albion by Sam Byers, who's an English author. I've read one of his other books called Idiopathy, I think, Sickness of Ideas. I'm really conflicted about this book. I really don't know quite on what side I come down on it. So we're talking about the territory here of Dave Eggers' The Circle, Jarrett Kobeck's I Hate the Internet and Only Americans Burn in Hell. There's also, you know, non-bookish things would be things like Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror series about sort of self-surveillance of the internet, how we invite spies into our houses effectively. And even for those English viewers, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. And I'll come back to explain where those sort of fit in. And one of the problems for me with this book is, I think all of those do it better. They're much sharper. in dealing with the themes. And by the way, Leah of Reading in Bed, you keep sort of saying you're looking for books that will turn you off social media once and for all, but you keep restricting yourself, I think, from what I can tell, to non-fiction. If you read the likes of this, and if you read the likes of Jarrett Kobeck, I think they're going to do much more to help you turn away from social media than the non-fiction stuff. Anyway, that's a sidebar. So there's a town, an imaginary town in the English countryside called Edmondsbury, which I think is a play on Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. It has a population of 50,000. It, for some reason, has become a bit of a tech hub, potentially. And there's a cast of characters. So the first one is called Jess, who has been the victim in London, while she was living in London, of an online harassment campaign. And she sort of leaves London and comes under the wing of a not witness protection, but victim protection group. And is particularly sort of mentored and looked after by somebody called Deepa. I'll come back to that. Her boyfriend is called Robert, and he is a blogger of middling reach, and is what you would describe as a liberal. Then there is a character called Hugo Bennington, who's the leader of a right-wing, just below the level of white supremacy party, who's got his eye on the main chance and thinks that, you know, with the upsurge of sort of feeling against migrants and people sort of, you know, taking jobs and benefits from British in a post-Brexit world, that he can, you know, he can get elected to Parliament. Then there are other characters who I will come to. And this is all about a social media storm. And the weird thing about social media is that it collapses space. You know, you can talk to people on the other side of the world, and that relationship only really changes when you actually meet them in the flesh. Here, for all its collapsing of space, everything is centred in this town of Edmondsbury, which makes no sense to me at all. And I think it's a weakness of the book. And even though it's sort of explained away in the end why that is, and I can't say because that would be a spoiler, I didn't buy it. Having said that, there's some really, really good satire and some really, really good writing here, because on the one hand you've got how, you know, even a couple of words online can, you know, draw down, you know, ire, bile, mobilise, you know, online trolls and armies, so that the individual's tweets can become a rallying call to become a historical force, and that is portrayed in here, portrayed very well. So they're, you know, loose lips sink ships. You know, if you're not careful with how you use language online, you know, it can spiral and create this sort of huge, you know, have this huge impact, which again happens to be centred in Edmondsbury, which I don't buy. And on the other hand, you've got the meaningless of language, which is what this book is the strongest at, which is office speak, you know, motivational speaking, team bonding, all of that sort of stuff. And it satirises it brilliantly, I think. So I'm just going to read a section of this. So this is a meeting called Bream and Holt, who prided themselves on allowing not a single second of non-productivity to burst the fragile bubble of their efficiency, were already present, reclining awkwardly on the bean bags Green provided for meetings, in the misguided belief that they countered formality. Tablets propped on their knees, styluses windmilling through their fingers while they fretted over the wasted moments lost to Trina's not quite instantaneous appearance. Perched on a slightly larger beanbag, repeatedly adjusting himself as the malleable floor furniture rejected his portly form and deposited him onto the carpet, was Norbiton. "Trina," said Norbiton, "glad you could make it." The alert implied it was compulsory, said Trina. "It is. I was using a standard idiom by way of greeting." "Consider me greeted," said Trina, lowering herself to the other's level. "Right," said Norbiton. "All present, let's begin." He turned a page on his defiantly retro legal pad and tapped the paper with a chewed biro. Bream and Holt exchanged glances. "As all of you no doubt know," Norbiton began, "on Friday night Edmondsbury experienced what, for the want of a better word, we are currently describing as an incident. A group of people calling themselves the Griefers assembled." "We all know what happened," said Bream. "Great," said Norbiton. "Excellent. I was just making sure. Let's move on," said Holt. "Well, maybe if we start by—" "We are all short of meeting minutes is the point," said Bream, "so this has to be a very targeted meeting." "Fine," said Norbiton. "I'll get to the point. Got to point out here that saying you'll get to the point only further reduces the speed at which you're able to actually get to the point, said Holt. Noted, said Norbiton. Anyway, we're what, 2 minutes in, said Bream, and I'm hearing literally nothing. Green are, as you can imagine, concerned, said Holt, because if you're about to say that they're concerned, I think we could all safely say that we've gathered that much. Let's skip the concern, said Bream. Drill down to the relevant detail. Norbiton, Trina noticed, was starting to sweat slightly. I heard you were a tough team, he said. Kind of a tangent, no, said Bream. My timer says 3 minutes, said Holt. And there's a lot of that in this book. It's funny, it's clever, it shows the meaningless, the emptying, the hollowness of language. So you compare, how a sort of, inflammatory, 140, 280, character tweet compared with that meaningless language. And of course the humour is that these guys, Bream and Holt, in pointing out all the ways that the meeting is being sort of not getting to the point and taking longer than it should, are doubling that sort of dilatoriness. But anyway, so there are lots of really good things in here, but ultimately it comes down to the characters. So Hugo Bennington, they all get their comeuppance in one way and another, and quite frankly, they all deserve it. And the book is trying to weigh up how much free will do we have in an internet age, and how much is it manipulation by forces we're completely oblivious of, even though we invite them into our lives, which is a perfectly legitimate subject. All these characters get their comeuppance, and you can only feel good, glad. So Jess, for example, who's the person who should have the most sympathy, she has a really interesting relationship with Robert, in that she creates all these sort of false personas and uses one of them to troll Robert's blog column, because, as she says, that enables them in their actual fleshy, proximate life together. All her anger is played out, so they can live perfectly happily without any conflict, because she's got it all out of her system. And it also, she says, that other character, that non-existent character, there's a real frisson to trolling your own boyfriend. It's almost like a sexual thrill. So that's very interesting. But ultimately, it all comes tumbling down, and that's not really a spoiler. So you kind of think, well, you invited it on yourself. You went to all with trolls and had to beat a retreat, and you've become a troll yourself. Robert is the classic example of scratch a liberal to reveal a fascist. He is power crazy. He just wants status. He wants success, and is prepared to sort of sell anything of his soul to get that. And he achieves this status towards the end of the book. Power, Robert thought to himself, standing in the kitchen, sipping coffee, had taken new, almost unrecognisable forms. Once the measure of a man's reach had been dependent on his presence, his access, his ability to be where others couldn't go. Now the ultimate demonstration of influence was the degree to which you didn't need to go anywhere at all. There were no real press buses, no thrumming nerve centres of media activity. Real power looked like this. A man stood in his kitchen in his socks, commanding outcomes from a piece of seclusion. Referring to sort of, online, drama. That they're all sucked into this sort of online drama. Hugo Bennington, the crypto-fascist, well, he gets his comeuppance. And, there's a lot of one-to-one dialogues in this book, where basically people are sort of defining their positions, or having their positions defined and sharpened by mentors. So Robert is having his, defined by a group of social and culturally superior people who he wants to leap into bed with, plus his boss, who basically just wants anything that's going to be successful and is driving Robert towards the move from liberal to crypto-fascist. The Hugo Bennington, the fascist himself, he has an advisor called Terry Handler, who is a lifestyle guru coach, very successful on YouTube. And it's not entirely clear why he would get into bed with a low life, low rent guy, crypto-fascist, even if his prospects seem good. Other than, this sort of tech male, white male, brohood, can very easily lapse into a sort of, white supremacy thing. I think that's the implication. It's from a satirical point of view, his character is very funny because he uses all this sort of new age tech speak meets, life sort of skills speech. But it didn't quite work. So there's a lot of these dialogues which are just polemic, really. You know, they are just the author making sure that all these different political positions are represented, and he explains them to them. There's too much. It's not lecturing you. I mean, it's done in a subtle way, but it is really just the author getting his points across that he wants to get. So, as I say, you know, I didn't buy the fact that, you know, the infinite space of the globe is compressed into Edmondsbury, even though towards the end that is tried to be justified, and why exactly that is. I didn't like the characters, any of them. I thought they all got their just desserts. And yet the book raises some really important issues, I think, about this collapse of space and about, you know, language being sort of, you know, eroded and hollowed out versus being made inflammatory, which is sort of the same thing, because inflammatory language on Twitter or whatever, or Facebook, probably is actually completely hollow. You know, it's Trump's, you know, red meat to his supporters kind of language, that kind of thing. You know, Hugo Bennington, the crypto-fascist, I mean, we don't learn anything new about that mentality and how people can flock to his cause and how he thinks. You know, he's an absolute, what we call here in the UK, gammon. You know, that sort of, you know, round-faced, close-cropped hair, red face because it's basically unhealthy, sort of, you know, pulsing vein. All the cliches about this guy, and as much as Byers tries to sort of make him human, he is a caricature, and we learn nothing about the appeal of the right. You know, the liberal left is, you know, this is part of why Trump is riding the crest of the wave that he is, cannot deal with the appeal of the far right, doesn't understand it, can't begin to comprehend it, therefore can't analyse it in any meaningful, useful way in books like this. So I give this sort of 3.5, 4, because there's too many good bits of writing and interesting ideas in here for it to be a dud book. But as I think the problem is, it's very. Why I said the other books were sharper is because as works of literature, they weren't as fragile as this. You know, this is not a literary work. I mean, it's not dumbed down. But there's very little literary writing in there. And of course books don't have to be literary writing. Like Jared Kobeck, his novels are barely novels. In that sense, they're not literary. But there's something about them where they have greater breadth and density than this, which just felt very fragile to me. You know, Byers choreographs the movements of all the players very well, how they interact and move in and move out into impacting each other's lives. That's done really well, but I didn't believe it. It all just felt too plot bound in order to move the plot on, in order to move the sort of chain of reaction on, rather than having any sort of genuine literary merit in itself. Well, I don't know if that sounds harsh, but that's how I felt about the book. So, you know, a brave stab, but ultimately one I felt lagged behind Kobeck, Dave Eggers. It's really annoying me. There's another writer in this sphere. Oh yes, Will Wiles, Plume, who is a mate and actually acknowledged in the back of this book. But I feel Will Wiles' Plume is much more literary and much more successful at dealing with a lot of the themes that are in here, such as how online self-surveillance collapses space and all that sort of stuff. And I just thought Will Wiles' Plume is so much more successful. And the reason I raised Yes Minister, again for those Americans who aren't familiar with it, apologies, talking about an 80s sitcom in the UK here, set in Parliament, it's because when characters speak to each other in here and they're sort of, you know, qualifying their political position, you know, what you can say, what you can't, what's going to play well, what's not going to play well in the media, the manipulators, such as Terry Handler, such as the people manipulating Robert, they are just like the civil servants of Humphrey in Yes Minister. And that felt very tired in this context of this book. So there you go. And finally, Jane Allison, Meander, Spiral, Explode, Design and Pattern in Narrative. So this is a non-fiction book about, it's really literary criticism. And it's saying, you know, well, Aristotle gave us this thing called poetics, where you have a beginning, middle and an end, and you can plot an arc of a story, that is the narrative drive, towards the denouement. And Jane Allison here says, well, there's other patterns, you know, the arc isn't the be-all and end-all of narrative. So she talks in terms of meandering narratives, spiralling narratives, explosive narratives, cell structure narratives, fractal narratives. There's just, and at first I thought this book was not, what I thought it was going to be at all. But then as it wore on, I realised it's a really excellent piece of writing because it studies a lot of examples which it reproduces in here, mainly short stories, not exclusively, but mainly short stories and novellas, which is interesting. I'll come back to why. Clarice Lispector, W.J. Sable's The Emigrants, Joyce Carol Oates, and so on and so on and so on. And she goes, she gives really, really good analyses of these and ties them up to the shapes. Now, why I say I didn't think it was quite what I thought is she just leaves it for you. She says, here's an example of this structure, here's another example of this structure. But she doesn't really come to any conclusions as to why that might be important or significant, other than there are other ways to approach narrative structure and to think about structure. And I give this 5 stars. But, for my part, I would say, well, yeah, you're still obsessed with pattern, interestingly. You're finding all these patterns. And something like fractals seems to me the reductio ab absurdum of pattern finding. Mankind apparently is a seeker after pattern, to make things, sort of conform to our preset perception patterns. And I understand that. I reject it as much as I can, as much as is humanly possible in my own life and in my own writing, because I think it actually limits our imaginations and limits our thinking. She's very much tied to, there are these different patterns, but I'm going, well, why do there have to be patterns at all? Chaos theory with fractals and Mandelbrot sets and stuff. As I say, it seemed to me to be the reductio ab absurdum. Why do we need to impose patterns on things that seem random and chaotic in chaos theory? So, as I say, the top line didn't give me what I wanted at all, but actually, irrespective of that, because her examples are so good, because her explanations and analysis are so good, I thought this was a tremendous book, and I would recommend this to writers who want to explore the possibilities of narrative structure. And I first came across this on Infinite Text's BookTube channel. She tipped me off onto this, so thank you very much. Really useful read. And as it's Friday Reads, just on to what I'm currently reading or about to read. So I'm currently reading 1,000 Years of Non-Linear History by Manuel de Landa, which I found quoted in a book called Sonic Flux, which I really enjoyed this year. Yes, non-linear. You might see a theme beginning to develop in line with that. And I've got a week off work on holiday coming up. Ostensibly it is meant to be writing my latest work in progress, but in case that doesn't happen and the Muse has also packed their suitcase and on their holiday, I shall be considering reading these books. So The House of Leaves, everyone knows Mark Danielewski wrote that, but what else did he write? Has anyone ever read anything else by Mark Danielewski? So I thought about time I did. This is called Only Revolutions, and does some strange typographical things, as you can see. Text upside down and the right way up on the same page, so looking forward to that. 2 books I bought in my recent London book call with Celia and Elizabeth at Bookish North. Concrete by Thomas Bernhardt, which will be my first introduction to Bernhardt. I'd always assume that all of his books are sort of quite weighty tomes, and look, here's a short book, so that would be my introduction to him. And Witold Gombrowicz, Pornographia, and again, another quite short book. Got this second hand at Scoob Books. I'd heard of this writer quite recently. He kept cropping up. I've never read anything by him. And so that is that. And finally, Toby Litt, King Death. So Toby Litt's a writer I've read quite a while back, some of his early work. He's currently getting lots of plaudits for a non-fiction work about his father, which is set in the world of wrestling, I think. But I wasn't really interested in that. But I saw this. Oh, when's it published by? When was it published? 2010, so it's quite old. Nice black pages there for King Death. So there you have it. That is my Friday Reads. Thank you very much. Till next time.